For those of you out there that are British Bake Off fans or British Bake Off watchers, it struck me that the smorgastarta that they made is exactly what gets covered in the Flaky Foodie episode on Finnish food and sauna culture. So don't forget to go check out Jess on the Flaky Foodie, who's always one step ahead of the rest of us. Episode 61, 18th Century North American Rice, a History. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how rice got to North America the first time, and a bit of its history before that. I'll also try my darndest not to get pulled completely off track by the wide, wild ocean that is the entirety of global rice history. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know about the rice of 18th century North American British colonies is that it came from West Africa and probably Madagascar. The rice of post-Civil War America will be very different rice. There had likely been rice in the colonies by the end of the 17th century, but not much, and not as a commercial crop. And there were probably at least two major types. I didn't cover it last century because the evidence is spotty and rice simply wasn't all that present. But in the 18th century, rice becomes a major force in the growing economic presence of the British North American colonies. But before we can get to the life of 18th century North American colonial rice, we need to, talk about the history of global rice. This is a very big topic, with elements that people take very seriously. If you think I was dealing with the danger of archaeological and historical slap fights when it came to things like horse evolution and the presence of African cheese, well, rice is even more fraught. So with that in mind, let's dive into a narrow history of the first American rices. Like apples and fish sauce and fermented drinks, rice is a global food item that exists in many different forms. Different versions have developed over the ages that are more and less closely related. Some varieties have become wildly popular and others exist only in small pockets. Some have deep cultural ties and long-standing mythologies. It's a thing that travels well, so like those other items, rice has influenced cultures in ways that can be seen, felt, and tasted, but the connection from arrival to influence can be very tenuous. Food is awfully ethereal when you are looking for the origin point. In an act of self-preservation, instead of covering the complete global history of rice up to the 18th century, after a very general overview, I will turn my attentions to just that rice that was being grown in North America in the 18th century. And that will be a big enough job. Then next week, we get to hear about boiling rice in the 18th century colonial kitchen. Okay, so rice. Like wheat and barley and rye and oats, millet and corn, it's a grass. These all fall under the classification of cereals. That is, their seeds, protected inside a tough seed coat, contain a large starchy box of baby food packed along with the fertilized germ to get the seed off to a good start in life. The starch is in a stable form that is resistant to degradation, unlike, say, fruits, which act as compost for their seeds and sometimes transport. Fruits rot and generally plan on germinating the contained seeds pretty soon. Cereal seeds are happy to wait through the winter until things get damp and warm before they sprout. They can even wait several years. But it's during that sprouting when enzymes get activated and the starch gets turned into sugar, and then the seeds can use the sugar to grow until they have leaves to make sugar on their own. This process of turning the starch to sugar, that's the malting process we talked about in beer making, by the way. Oh, and for the trivia centers of your brain, all these grass cereal grains are classed as monocots versus most other food plants, which are dicots. All that means is when a seed sprouts, it puts out very characteristic first leaves or a first leaf, and those leaves are called cotyledons. All the grasses and our cereal grains, wheat, rye, corn, oats, and rice, all each put out a single first leaf or a monocotyledon. While most other plant foods, fruit trees, beans, radishes, potatoes, peppers, peanuts, and so on, put out two baby leaves, or dicotyledons. That's all that means. Anyway, so as grain eaters, rice was familiar as a grain, or as they said it back then, corn, in lots of ways to our 18th century eaters. But there was also much about rice that made it both strange and fancy to people raised on bread and porridges made from wheat, rye, oats, and barley. And before I get any further, I'm going to sideline wild rice until the 19th century. That's when the western edge of the brand new U.S. military and early pioneers run across it. It's a grass as well, but under the genus Zizania. It's a cousin to true rices, but is different in a few important ways, and I promise I'll explain later. So, rice, like horses and apples, does have an origin point somewhere, but grasses are so old and widespread that that place is lost to time. However, the Oryza genus of grasses that developed into all the true rices had tempting and delicious enough qualities that it was domesticated 3 different times on 3 different continents: Asia, Africa, and South America. The South American rice still can be found in its wild and feral forms in swampy areas, but the combination of disruptive European arrivals, some homegrown environmental disasters, and the arrival of Asian rices did end South American rice cultivation by about the 17th century. But rice was domesticated and grown as a crop in that Amazonian hotbed of horticultural development that unleashed corn, tomatoes, peanuts, squash, chili peppers, and cocoa beans on the world. Oryza sativa, or Asian rice, also known as tropical or wetland rice, is the rice most of us eat most of the time. Sativa rice can be vaguely sorted into the short-grained sticky varieties of japonica and sinica, see there's that sini prefix denoting China, of the typical East Asian rice bowl, and then the long and extra long grains that end up separate, of the indica variety we associate with South and Central Asian and Persian food. There are, of course, approximately a zillion varieties and sub-varieties in between, including my personal favorites, the fragrant jasmine rice types. But this is not the rice, or at least not directly the rice, that came to the eastern shores of North America at the end of the 17th century. The East Asian rice story will have to wait for gold and pioneers and settlers and railroads in the 19th century. So just wait on that. The rice that fed the early southeastern colonies and built the economic engine of the colony of South Carolina was the rice of West Africa and, probably, of Madagascar. Wait, what? All right, story time. Madagascar is a chunk of the African supercontinent tectonic plate that broke off and went for a swim in the Indian Ocean about 100 million years ago. For those of us who grew up with a certain biology bent or are lured by cute animals, we know it as the home of the lemurs and other strange and striking plant, animal, and insect life. Despite being close to the African continent, it has long had commerce with the seafaring peoples that live along the rim of the Indian Ocean. And for reference, Madagascar is about the size of the states of California and Oregon combined, or the size of all 13 original colonies, or about twice the size of the island of Britain. If you look at a flat map of the world, Madagascar seems frightfully far away from North America. After all, it is all the way on the other side of the perfectly enormous continent of Africa. And you may remember from season 1 that the Portuguese spent nearly a century trying to sail around it, until Vasco da Gama finally did in 1498 and helped upend the spice trade and laid the groundwork for the modern global trading network with seaborne pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. But if you look at the world on a globe, the open area around the southern end of South America and Africa creates a sort of omni-portal to anywhere in the world from anywhere else. The Portuguese were trying to get around Africa by following the African coast. By the 18th century, everyone knew you didn't follow coastlines to get places. Instead, you used these long diagonals called rumline networks or windrose networks on these odd-looking maps called portolan charts. A savvy sailor used these and carefully guarded knowledge of prevailing currents and winds to crisscross the watery globe. By the end of the 17th century and on into the 18th, good sailing masters transporting global goods or moving between floating battlefields or starting to chase the rich game of the oil-rich whales, They saw the world as a vast road dotted with bits of land one aimed for with the intent to make money. They followed the compass headings of the portolan charts when out of sight of land to aim more or less for the points they were heading for. It divided up the sea into a series of diamonds and triangles that could be found and followed more or less using the sight of stars at night and a magnetic compass. And yes, I'll have links to this navigational alchemy in the show notes. As a result of these innovations in navigational technology, we ended up with first a New Amsterdam and then a New York colony with strong ties to a pirate fort in Madagascar, which delivered stolen riches from disintegrating kingdoms on the Indian subcontinent and stolen people from coastal areas to feed a labor-hungry North America that was willing to buy. All the sailors needed to do was follow one diagonal to get south of the Cape of Good Hope, and then head on a second diagonal across the equator and the Atlantic Ocean to get to New York, using the dependable trade winds of the Atlantic. If you want to go back and revisit the information about the New York-Madagascar connection, it's back in episode 50 when I covered the influence of pirates on 18th century mercantilism. Madagascar, before it was a pirate center and clearinghouse for stolen goods and stolen people, had been a series of kingdoms in its own right. The earliest settlements are tied to canoe voyagers from Indonesia and Malaysia and travelers from East Africa. So despite its proximity to the African continent, Madagascar owes as much of its identity to the connections it made across the Indian Ocean as it does to much closer Africa. The canoe voyagers from across the Indian Ocean, from Malaysia and Indonesia, appear to have brought the Asian rice, Oryza sativa, with them, and developed the wet rice paddy cultivation needed for this style of rice. East Africans also moved onto the island and brought with them their dryland Oryza glaberrima. Even today, both the dryland and the wetland rices are grown in Madagascar. The Asian rice has a higher output but requires more labor for the transplanting and the wet paddy maintenance, and far more water. The dryland rice grows in dirt, more like other cereal grains, and requires far less effort, is more drought tolerant, and is cool weather tolerant. Understanding how Madagascar, which is so far away, can be kind of close by using the 18th century nautical view of the world starts to make sense of the story told about the arrival of rice in South Carolina. The origin story that would have been told at the bicentennial in 1976 was that in 1685, a captain, John Thurber, was blown off course from his trip from Madagascar and limped into the young port of Charlestown, now known as Charleston, in the colony of South Carolina. As part thanks or payment for the aid or repairs or hospitality he received, Thurber supposedly gifted a peck of Madagascar seed rice to one Dr. Henry Woodward, a ship's surgeon, who also owned a low country plantation on John's Island, and from there, supposedly, the South Carolina rice industry was born. Now, there's no disputing the fact that South Carolina was exporting tens of thousands of pounds of rice annually by 1698, and that it grew to 395,000 pounds in 1700. That's around 200,000 kilos. There are receipts and accounts of rice waiting by the quayside as ships of the time were overwhelmed by the volume. There had been a 40-fold increase in just 3 years. By the middle of the 18th century, rice accounted for around half of the total value of South Carolina exports, more than tobacco, more than indigo, and more than forest products. Cotton was present in the colonies, but as a part of the British Empire, it was only a marginal player in cotton in the early 18th century. North America would not become a major player in the cotton market until after the Revolutionary War. For rice to explode from a single bag to thousands and then hundreds of thousands of pounds in 15 years is unlikely, especially considering the technology and communication habits of the time. But more importantly, we need to recognize the utter ignorance of the North American colonial planter of how rice was grown. Other than in southern Spain, there was no rice cultivation in Europe. Even the ancient Romans had it imported from India. And in Spain, It had been introduced by the Arabs during the years of Al-Andalus, just as they likely introduced Asian rice to West Africa. What makes much more sense is that yes, that bag of Madagascar rice likely did arrive and yes, was grown on Dr. Woodward's plantation. But other rice was already growing in South Carolina before the arrival of the Madagascar bag, both the wetland and the dryland types, the Asian sort and the African sort. Because both types were also being grown by the tribes of West Africa, especially in the area then known as the Senegambia, now known as Sierra Leone and Liberia. Both types of rice were grown for many reasons. Some as sort of a hedge. A bad rain year wouldn't mean starvation, and a good year would mean a surplus that could be stored and traded for other things. And different types of land were best for different types of rice. After all, different parts of the west coast of Africa were known as the Pepper Coast, the Ivory Coast, and the Gold Coast. There was also the Rice Coast. So Asian rice had been brought to Madagascar by canoe, but Asian rice had also been brought to West Africa, most likely by Arab traders. They had been drawn to coastal West Africa through the salt trade and the evergreen and quite true legend of the gold wealth of the Ghana, Mali, and Songhay empires. The literal tons of gold Mansa Musa had brought to Egypt in the 14th century to display the wealth of his empire, possibly as much as 18 tons, had left an impression that fascinated and even haunted adventurers centuries later. Dryland rice, or what would come to be known in the young United States as home rice, was already a staple crop in sub-Saharan Africa as long as 3,000 years ago. Its lower yield per acre or hectare than wetland rice was balanced by it being a lower labor crop, more like wheat or millet. It didn't require the intense social organization and large-scale land architecture projects that paddy-grown rice does. So when the trade in West African captives as slaves spread out over Europe and then the New World, rice came along, both the wetland and the dryland kind, just as sesame, okra, and the double-transported tomatoes and peanuts did. And it meant, whether Oryza sativa or Oryza glaberrima, all the first rice in the British North American colonies arrived via Africa and was grown by Africans. By the end of the 17th century, England had firmly established its place as the leading slave transporter. The Royal African Company ran the largest depots along the southern parts of the West African coast, and British shipyards in the Old World and the New were gobbling up the timber, forest products being harvested, and hemp being grown in the New World. Britain had its sugar colonies running and competed with the Dutch in northern Brazil and the French at Saint-Domingue in both the sugar and slave markets. 12 of the 13 North American colonies were established by the end of the 17th century. Only Georgia waited until the 18th, and it was originally to be a promised land where degraded prisoners could find a new life as upstanding farmers. Well, that's how it was advertised. It was a penal colony that outlawed slavery because how could you compel convict labor if there was a more despised caste present? So by the 18th century, each colony or region had its primary economic territory more or less carved out. Virginia grew tobacco, New York produced wheat and dairy, New Hampshire was ill-defined and relatively lawless, but provided deerskins, white pines, and other forest products. Pennsylvania was a major source of iron and wheat. Massachusetts produced salt fish, while North Carolina was the source of salt beef and smoked pork. Rhode Island was the home of rum, and New Jersey was earning its moniker of the Garden State, providing produce to the bustling ports to its north and south. The smallest mid-Atlantic colonies of Connecticut, Delaware, and Maryland were home to no particular economic powerhouse, but participated in farming and shipping, as well as fencing pirate treasure through their large numbers of silversmiths. And South Carolina became the rice kitchen. Back in Europe, rice was the grain of luxury, while wheat bread was the most desired bread and the staff of life. Barley beer was of course the preferred drink of both crofter and king, but rice as a chameleon grain was treasured, coveted, and imported at great expense. Michael Twitty, in his rice cookbook in the Savor the South series, explains, rice has its own intrinsic grandeur. Rice dances with the other foods at the feast. For rice was used in savory foods and sweet foods and in white foods. In the 16th and 17th century, there was a whole class of foods developed that were white in color and soft and gentle. In later ages, these would become sickroom foods and nursery foods and comfort foods, but they started as fancy foods and fast day foods and delicate rich lady foods based on their gentleness, their smoothness, their blandness, and yes, their whiteness. And possibly most importantly, the sheer time and effort and expense required to prepare them correctly. These were puddings and drinks and pottages that required almonds, white bread, rice and rice flour, cream, eggs, and expensive spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, and essences of rose and orange and ambergris. These were the forerunners to the bread pudding, rice pudding, blancmange, almond milk flans, and hot spiced milks. And of course then, the best milk would be almond milk, sometimes mixed with rice. After all, just about anyone could get dairy milk, cow or sheep or goat in season. But almonds required silver. The same with rice. In Britain, one could grow wheat and oats and rye and barley, but not rice. That had to be imported and purchased. And so it was, with this market in mind, that South Carolina rice was established. When it was declared a colony in 1670, all sorts of agricultural schemes were considered and attempted: sugar, silk, tobacco, indigo. But it was too cool for sugar, and the mulberry trees were the wrong sort for silkworms, and the caterpillars they were using, those were the wrong sort for silk. Look, a lot of science got going in the 17th century, but we were trillions of cups of caffeine away from our modern orderliness of information. Virginia had the lock on tobacco, and by the middle of the century, it wasn't worth it to start a new venture in that crowded field. And indigo required specialized cultivation and processing that wouldn't be cracked until the middle of the 18th century. But rice was a crop that was known, and the rice growers were known. So the Senegambia area, especially of the African coast, was plundered for people with the skills and knowledge to do wetland or Rhiza sativa rice. In the 18th century, the land needed for constructing successful paddies had to be wet, tropical, practically underwater, and as a result, highly bug infested. I have a link in my show notes that shows the swampy, effectively underwater areas that rice was grown in the 18th century. Knowledge about the timing of planting, the watering, the flooding, and the drying of the fields was purchased with the bodies and labor of these rice coast Africans, as was the knowledge of how to harvest, dry, and polish the rice in large hand-carved wooden mortars and pestles. During harvest season, women rhythmically pounding the rice and then fanning it in flat baskets to remove the chaff was a feature all along the low country South Carolina plantations. And while these people were exploited for their rice growing and processing knowledge, they also brought their rice cookery knowledge with them as well. And the dishes and products of the Carolina Rice Kitchen are what we will cover next week. Pilau, purlieu, jollof, callas, bread, porridge, pancakes, and pudding. But strangely, not beer. Rice beer actually will have to wait for the 20th century. That's right. Next week, we close the book on regular history and get back to what people were cooking and eating. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. And this week will include a video. Email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. As always, I would really appreciate a few words to review this podcast. Your typing really does make a difference, and it makes me more visible. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOA Food and in the show description.